waiting to see if I get a signal that I should start. Welcome, everybody, to the Wilson Center. I'm Andrew Redmond. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us today, here, live in person, or online. This is something we've been working on. This book project is something we've been working on for quite some time, so we're really quite excited that today is finally the day where we can share it with all of you. 2024 is a critical year, will be a critical year for Mexico. The June 2nd election will be the largest in the country's history and perhaps the most consequential. Mexican voters will be choosing their president, likely the first woman ever, to lead the country at a time of great challenges: inequality, violence, impunity, climate change, geopolitical instability, among others, and great potential, from nearshoring, from strengthening North American cooperation, and from developing collaborative strategies to address common threats like supply chain resilience and natural phenomena. So the question for 2024, of course, is will voters give Morena an additional sexenio to implement the fourth transformation, or will they seek a return to a more traditional, more market-oriented administration? So about a year ago, as we started developing our 2023 work plan, we started thinking about the significance of 2024, and this book is really a culmination or a product of a lot of those conversations. The book is both therefore a beginning and an end, or an end and a beginning. It's the culmination of our work this year, and it's the inauguration of our election-focused work that really kicked off a couple weeks ago when we launched our elections website, mexicoelections.wilsoncenter.org. And we will continue to work on that topic and related issues all the way through the June 2nd election and the October 1st inauguration. To put this book together, we chose 6 issues that are critically important to Mexico and that will require collaboration with the United States and sometimes Canada to successfully resolve. So over the past 9 months, about 9 months, we organized public and private events, presentations, informal conversations, some large, some small, and we, of course, participated in events and meetings that were organized by other organizations here in the US and in Mexico. And every time, at every opportunity, whether it was a specific meeting or something more broad-based, we tried to think about how what we heard in those events, what our speakers suggested, et cetera, connected to the topics that we chose to put in the book. And many of you here today, either online or here in person, participated in those conversations. You may see language or recommendations in the book that reflect your input. You may also see things in the book that you don't fully agree with, and that's okay too. It's really important here at the Wilson Center that we celebrate diverse viewpoints and we welcome constructive feedback. So let me tell you a little bit about, before I talk about what the book is, about what it isn't, just to be clear. The book covers 6 issues. They're not the only issues we could have chosen. They're not the only issues for which collaboration will be helpful or necessary, and they're certainly not the only issues that the new president will need to address. In fact, I think it's important to note that the recommendations in the book focus on some of the issues that Mexico and its next president can tackle. They're not necessarily aimed at addressing those that concern the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, though, as you all know, many of them are intrinsically linked. They are intermestic in nature. So it's almost impossible, of course, to talk about a lot of these issues without thinking about the role or the connection to the United States. To keep the sections readable, they don't necessarily cover every possible angle or every sub-issue. Instead, they try to highlight some of the key aspects or elements of large, complex issues. Some offer a more nuanced view of certain, we could call them sub-issues, that are sometimes neglected or not discussed as frequently. The book also tries to be forward-looking and aimed at identifying steps that could be taken by the next president, regardless of their party affiliation. They're based on the author's assessment of the state of affairs now and how things will be on Inauguration Day in 2024. And as such, while there are critiques of past policies, The book doesn't assess the overall performance of past or present administrations. The book is also not meant to be a definitive to-do list. It's not our place to tell the candidates what to do, nor do we expect that the presidential campaigns or the candidates will immediately commit to adopting all the recommendations. Though admittedly, if they choose to do so, that would be great. We do, however, hope that the candidates, their advisors, the campaigns, and other public officials and future members of Congress will find the framing of the challenges and the opportunities that the new president will face to be helpful, and that they will indeed consider the recommendations. In other words, the book should be taken as a point of departure that urges the candidates, parties, and voters to consider what needs to be done to address the challenges and to capitalize on the opportunities that will contribute to Mexico's economic and social development in the next sexenio and beyond. In reading the individual sections, one thing that comes through, perhaps not surprisingly, is the degree to which they intersect and overlap. This confirms, we think, that we chose some of the most critically important issues, but it also underscores the interconnected nature of public policy making in today's world. You really can't attack or address any issue in a vacuum or stovepipe it apart from others. The individual authors will talk about their sections, so I'm not going to steal their thunder, but I do want to point out some of the numerous interconnections and overlaps among the sections before we turn to them. I think it's pretty clear that addressing any single issue of the ones that we've chosen will have knock-on impacts on others. Energy, for example, connects to nearshoring, which helps drive economic development, which then has a positive impact on security and migration. Improving citizen security enhances Mexico's ability to attract nearshoring. Addressing Mexico's deficient water infrastructure will help mitigate the impact of climate change and thus reduce the migratory push. And incorporating migrants and returning migrants into Mexican society can have a positive impact on several of the issues contained in the book. I think there are lots of other linkages and connections which I'm sure will be identified shortly, and those of you in the audience may have already thought of some yourselves. A third observation is that implementing many of the recommendations will cost money, and it will require leadership willing to take on vested interests, to take a long-term view of problems and solutions, and to work collaboratively with the United States. It might not be possible, politically or financially, to implement all the recommendations in the book at once, even if the next president wishes to do so. She will need to make tough decisions about priorities. Our book purposefully does not try to make those decisions for her. Moving beyond this afternoon, we look forward to engaging with the campaigns and the candidates and their surrogates over the coming months to discuss these and other critical issues in greater depth. We hope to hear whether the candidates agree with the diagnoses contained in the book and the subsequent recommendations, or if they have alternative interpretations of the current situation in Mexico and the appropriate steps forward. If this book provokes conversation and debate, it will indeed have achieved its primary purpose and the purpose of the Mexico Institute. Just one final note as I wrap up. We have printed copies of the book available outside if you didn't already grab one. For those of us in person here today, and for the virtual viewers, the book is available in PDF form in both English and Spanish on the Mexico Institute website. And now to moderate our conversation, I'm going to turn it over to Leila Abed, our Deputy Director. Leila did yeoman's work on the editing and publishing of this book, for which we're really grateful. I don't think we could have gotten here without her help. But we are delighted to have her help and to have all of you here today. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Leila.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Andrew. I want to first welcome everybody here in person again, and to those of you joining us virtually. We are very excited that you're here to present our book for Mexico's upcoming elections on June 2nd. Before I introduce our amazing authors, who some of them I have the honor of calling colleagues, I want to go over a few housekeeping items with which Andrew already mentioned, but just in case some people have just joined, just a reminder to everybody that the text in both Spanish and in English of this booklet is available on the Mexico Institute website. So if you can, please go there and find it so you can follow along with the authors. We will begin today's event with brief presentations from our authors on each of their respective chapters, followed by a roundtable discussion with questions from the audience. In-person attendees, everybody that's here today, you can just raise your hands and ask a question. We'll have a microphone available for all of you. And for our virtual participants, you can send your questions to the Mexico Institute's X account at Mexico Institute. And finally, a reminder that the recording of today's event will be published on the Mexico Institute's website in the upcoming days. So without further ado, I will now present our authors. And for the sake of time, I will only be providing their current positions, but if you would like to know a more in-depth career, especially Ambassador Wayne, of all the achievements he has done, you can go ahead and see their full bios on our website. I'm briefly going to introduce them. To my left, I have Duncan Wood, Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Earl Anthony Wayne, former career ambassador. This is not just his current position, but I had to add something. Former career ambassador to Afghanistan, Argentina, and Mexico, and a public policy fellow here at the Mexico Institute. Should I introduce you to Andrew? I guess so. Andrew Rudman is the director of the Mexico Institute. I'm Leila Abed, deputy director of the Mexico Institute. We have the great pleasure of having here in person Ariel Ruiz, who's a senior policy analyst for the Migration Policy Institute, and Eric Marquez, who's a research intern at the Mexico Institute, but has done a tremendous job on really researching and putting together the water chapter of this booklet. I do want to briefly point out that we are missing two authors, Cecilia Farfan Mendez, who I had the pleasure of drafting and writing the security chapter with, and Alexandra Helfgott, who collaborated with Duncan to write the energy chapter. And speaking of energy, this is perhaps one of the most controversial issues in Mexico, particularly given the energy policies that the Mexican government has recently enacted. But as Andrew mentioned in his opening remarks, this book is forward-looking, and I think the energy chapter does just that. It mentions that there is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Mexico's next president to propel the country into a period of unprecedented prosperity and competitiveness. That is, if he or she develops a strategic energy agenda. So Duncan, we'll start off with you. Could you please provide a brief summary of your chapter, and in particular, discuss the so-called energy trilemma, right? So energy security, energy equity, sustainability, and how important it is to balance these three main dimensions of a nation's energy sector.
Thank you, Leila. I really wasn't expecting any questions at this point. Great pleasure to be here once again on a Mexico Institute panel. Congratulations to Andrew and Leila for putting together this publication. And thank you for already giving a shout out to Alexandra. Alexandra, who can't be with us because she's actually in Guadalajara, Mexico right now, just did an incredible job in putting together the research and a lot of the writing for this part of the book. Let me talk about the process that we went through to actually come up with these conclusions, because I think the methodology is actually important. Rather than just hearing from two foreigners giving their opinions about Mexico, we actually engaged in an extensive consultation process. We had 4 sessions, 2 of which were in person, 2 of which were virtual, where we brought together Mexican experts as well as some American observers of Mexican energy policy to discuss what the challenges were for the next president, as well as what the solutions should be. And this document here, or the chapter within this document, is but a small part of what will eventually emerge. In February of next year, we'll produce a white paper which goes into much greater depth on some of the recommendations that we put in here. And we will try to present that to the campaigns of the leading candidates early in 2024 so that it can have some impact upon the campaign. The members of the working group were extraordinarily generous with their time and with their opinions and their expertise. Special shout out to the Institute of the Americas, who hosted one of these conversations in La Jolla a couple of months ago. That's hell to go out to La Jolla in October, but we had to do it. When you bring together a diverse group of people in this kind of process, to quote a great American philosopher, life is like a box of chocolates and you never know what you're going to get. But in fact, we had an idea beforehand of what we were going to get. We had an idea before we started talking that, in fact, there was going to be a competitiveness agenda, that we needed to reform energy in Mexico in a meaningful way so that it could take full advantage of the nearshoring phenomenon, that it could really move ahead in terms of its economic development. What we didn't expect was that there would be a strong narrative emerging from those conversations that focused primarily on questions of energy poverty in Mexico and energy justice in Mexico, and the relationship between energy poverty, energy justice, internal migration, the lack of economic opportunities, particularly in the south of the country, and political sustainability of any energy policy. And that came through very, very clearly in each one of our conversations. And this helped to drive a lot of the structure of what we've put together in this chapter. We focused on the history or recent history of energy policy in Mexico. And when you've been around as long as I have and focusing on Mexican energy, you come to see things moving full circle. You know, from the reform attempts beginning in 2008 under the Calderon administration, ultimately abortive, through to the 2013 constitutional reform, which succeeded in terms of getting new legislation on the books and attracting enormous amounts of interest from international investors, through to the stagnation that came with the López Obrador administration post-2018, the fact that private investment was not encouraged, in fact, in many cases, was actually rejected and held up. The focus on energy sovereignty, taking us back to the previous era of pre-domination of the energy sector, of the country in general, and that idea that you didn't want to have any private or foreign investment, particularly in the hydrocarbon sector. A complicated relationship, therefore, that emerged with private companies, problems in terms of a level playing field between national, foreign, and public economic actors in the energy sector. And one rather unfortunate element, a highly personalized and politicized approach to questions of permitting, where if you have a problem with an energy regulatory agency in Mexico, the only real solution is to go to the Mexican president, to sit down at the National Palace and to negotiate one-on-one with him. And that ultimately presents the huge problem of, are we really talking about the economic rule of law in Mexico, or is this ultimately about a political rule of law? When you look at the outcomes of the recent history in Mexican energy policy, you see that it has hardly been a great success, either under the previous administration of Peña Nieto or under López Obrador. We've seen a collapse in oil production, albeit we've seen a temporary stabilization of oil production under López Obrador at around that 1.6 million barrels a day mark, but that seems to be highly fragile and tenuous and may well collapse further in the near future. We've seen, because of the reforms that took place in 2013 and the bidding rounds that began in 2015, we've seen a growing participation of the private sector in overall oil production, moving up to around 6% of total oil production in Mexico, but it could have been so much more. If we had had full buy-in to the energy reform by the López Obrador administration, then we would have seen much more private investment going in and much higher returns on that reform from 2013. In terms of natural gas, Mexico has imported more and more natural gas from the United States in recent years, but it has failed to fully develop or even really partially develop its own natural gas resources. In fact, there has been a neglect, and a not really benign neglect, of its natural gas sector. There are some exceptions to that. Some of the participants in our working group work in the natural gas sector, and they saw that there were some opportunities for the private sector to get involved in producing gas in Mexico. But the potential of Mexico, which is one of the world's largest countries in terms of the potential for fracking natural gas, the potential is being largely unrealized, which means that Mexico's focus on energy sovereignty under the López Obrador administration is ultimately being frustrated by a failure to invest in its own system. Throughout the conversations, we saw the recurring themes of competitiveness, energy transition, regulation, nearshoring, and ultimately equity. And if we can show the slide right now on the energy trilemma, when I came to write this article or this chapter with Alexandra, we fixed upon a concept which has come out of the World Energy Council over the last 15 years that looks at the need to balance 3 dimensions in any successful energy policy. The first of those is energy security, in other words, making sure that there is enough energy flowing through the system to make sure that the economy works. Secondly, energy equity, that in fact there is access to affordable energy, not just for the economy, but for all those who want to participate in the economy, including those who live in more marginalized areas. And lastly, sustainability. In other words, is this a sustainable, environmentally sustainable approach to energy policy? In the rankings, global rankings for the energy trilemma since 2010, Mexico has consistently performed very, very poorly. Ranked at around number 50, I think currently it's 46, its position has remained largely unchanged over the last decade. However, the weighting of each one of these factors has changed. At some points, Mexico did a lot better in terms of energy security. At other points, not so well. At some points, it did well on sustainability because it was moving in the right direction. Now, not so well. So that stagnation suggests to me that neither the fully liberal approach to energy policy in Mexico that we saw under the Peña Nieto administration, nor the largely restrictive and nationalistic approach under López Obrador is working. And that led to the conclusions and the recommendations that we put forward, which you can find in the book, of course, but I'll go through a couple of them just to draw out some lessons. And the first one is this. This came through very, very clearly from our working group, which is that the next Mexican president has to engage in a highly inclusive approach to developing a strategic vision for the energy sector. This cannot be something which comes out of one party. It can't be something that comes out of consulting just with business or with social groups. There has to be a comprehensive understanding of what the needs are of Mexican economy and society. Secondly, the fact that we've seen a collapse in oil production in Mexico over the last decade or so, 2 decades, really reflects the fact that the largest oil producer in the country, Pemex, the national oil company, has not been reformed. Billions of dollars have been plunged into Pemex, but Pemex has not been able to overcome its many economic and business problems, including, but not restricted to, the fact that its tax burden is really crippling. That number 2, the company is expected to do so many different things in the value chain, whereas it's really only good at certain things. And number 3, the fact that it has not been able to advance in terms of innovation and technology and know-how because of it is restricted from working with the private sector. So one of the things that we want to do, that we're putting forward, is to once again allow and indeed encourage Pemex to partner with private firms, as is permitted by the existing 2013 energy reform that's still on the books. That will be essential to moving the company forward, both in terms of production and technical capacity. The investment climate in Mexico must be reformed so that investors feel much more comfortable coming in, the level playing field, sanctity of contracts. Mexico has to boost its supplies of natural gas so that it increases its long-term energy security and energy independence. Mexico urgently needs to invest in its transmission capacity. The fact is that although the economy is slowly electrifying, there has been minimal investment in new transmission capacity, the national grid. And the fact is that the national electricity utility, the CFE, has limited capacity to do so itself. The private sector must be brought in here. Perhaps the most significant addition to the conversation that we brought in here is that in order to address the questions of energy equity in Mexico, much more investment must happen in bringing energy to the south of the country. And there is a golden opportunity there with the development of the interoceanic link or the trans-isthmus link in the south of Mexico. If that is to be truly built up as a corridor connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, and if there is going to be the development of nearshoring opportunities around that infrastructure project, there's the perfect excuse to bring in both natural gas and electricity and to build out renewable electricity supplies in that area, which just happens to be, of course, the windiest area of Mexico. That's where you have La Ventosa, perhaps one of the world's prime wind energy generating sites. If we can do that and we can think about the spillover for marginalized communities in the south of the country, that can be a transformative opportunity for the next president of Mexico. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Duncan. And what you had said, Andrew, at the beginning of this conversation, of all of these topics sort of being interlinked and related and overlapping, I think energy is one that will overlap and interconnect with both USMCA and North America, as well as nearshoring. But, you know, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, Ambassador Wayne, you very well know, we've had several conversations on this, plays a vital role, right, in the prosperity of the North American region. And while it is sort of a fundamental piece of bringing North America together, there's still a lot of progress to be made. And we're going to be coming up on the 4th anniversary of the agreement, and I think with the 2026 review on the horizon, there are great opportunities for the next Mexican president, which you point out in your chapter. All three partners, and this is something that you also mentioned, Ambassador, must work independently, bilaterally, trilaterally, utilizing mechanisms like the high-level economic dialogue, the North American Leaders Summit, to really strengthen regional supply chains, secure critical minerals, develop a sophisticated workforce, and address mutual changes, and also address disagreements through the USMCA dispute settlement mechanisms. And Andrew will talk about nearshoring after you, Ambassador, but I think with all of the recent events globally, from the COVID-19 crisis to Russia's invasion of Ukraine to disruptions to global supply chains, and the United States' intent to decouple itself from China, reinforce the need and the importance of a consolidated, integrated, and stronger North American region. And it's very interesting looking at the latest data that Mexico's trade with the U.S. totaled $600 billion through the first 9 months of 2023, securing a spot as the U.S.'s top trading partner. So with all of this being said, and you know way more than I do on this topic, Ambassador Wayne, and with the 2026 review just a couple of years away, what are some of the recommendations you propose to Mexico's next president to strengthen its relationship with its two North American neighbors and to attract more investment?
What am I timing to get going?
I have one. I have this that says 1 minute left, so I will be sharing that with you as well.
All right. Thank you, Leila.
You're welcome.
Well, first, as you've indicated, USMCA is sort of the foundation, the essential element for the rest of this competitiveness agenda, because it sets out the rules and the norms, the expectations, and the certainty within which the private sector can trade and can invest. But within that, there are a number of things where there's a great potential that has not yet been mobilized. And as you mentioned, there are other things that are never going to be just in a trade agreement, but are essential if a country is going to be more competitive in the world. And so that includes the agenda in the North American Leaders Summit. It includes the high-level economic dialogue with Mexico. It includes the U.S.-Canada dialogue, and it includes things that countries do on their own to improve their own attractiveness, as the United States did with three really large pieces of legislation, large in the sense of money to be invested and authorities and projects to be undertaken. And so all of these we have the chance right now for this all to go in a good direction. I think it is very important that USMCA show that it can resolve problems, and there's still some big problems to be resolved that hasn't been done, and we can mention that a little bit. But the key thing is that there's been a lot of growth going on, and that growth has really overshadowed the problems that have come up. But it's been accompanied by a sincere effort by all three countries to really implement the key parts of this agreement sincerely. And so I think that's really important. But remember, the bigger part of this agenda is the competitiveness agenda, and that includes all sorts of things that aren't really directly covered in USMCA. It includes the supply chains. It includes critical minerals. It includes nearshoring and reshoring. It includes upskilling those workers that we have out there, and it includes building the physical and digital infrastructure, which we don't yet have, that are essential to guarantee success in this very competitive global marketplace that we face. So, as mentioned, as Leila indicated, we're headed for a record this year of trade. In the first 3 years, trade across North America grew 29.8%. That's pretty impressive. That's a lot of growth. And it's not growing quite at that pace, but it's still growing. So that's impressive also. In fact, the OECD just came out with the FDI numbers for the first half of 2023. Number one in the world was, anybody remember? The United States for attracting FDI. But tied for number 3 were Canada and Mexico. Brazil was number 2. So something's working here in North America. People are seeing there's a dynamism here, and they are starting to invest. What we're going to be talking about, are they investing in the right ways? Can we keep them investing? And that's some of what Andrew's going to talk about and some of what I'm going to mention now here. As we come up to this 2026 review, what's going to happen in the 2026 review is that all 3 countries are going to sit down and say, okay, what's working, what's not working? Is this good enough to keep unchanged basically for the 19 years possible in this, or do we need to change some parts of it? But what's very important is that everybody figure out, how do you measure success? And we really haven't had a serious discussion about that in any of the countries, I think, going forward. But before you get to that review, you got to figure that out. What is successful in what you go forward? What are the objectives of each government, and what are our strategies to getting there? And part of that includes what, as diplomats, we call public diplomacy, because we remember what happens when publics don't like trade agreements. It makes it a lot harder for them to work smoothly and effectively. So, big disputes, 4 big disputes out there that need to be solved. One is, Duncan talked about, is energy, and he mentioned some of the practices that actually, I strongly believe, do violate USMCA norms. Second one is also involves Mexico, and that is GMO corn, and the proposals to ban the import of GMO corn without any transparent or scientific studies that have yet been shared, even though that's also required in the agreement. Third one is the U.S. Is a laggard on, they have lost a panel on the rules of origin for autos, very complicated, but they've just been silent about it. And so they're not setting a good precedent for either of the other countries. And then finally is the Canadian dairy dispute, which has gone on for a long time. Canada's already lost one finding on this, and another one coming up, and it's a very political problem in Canada and probably won't be solved soon. But it's very important for the credibility of the agreement that countries can find ways forward, even on the most difficult issues, and follow the procedures and not ignore them. So we're going to have to see what happens on that. Big innovation in USMCA is treatment of labor with this rapid response mechanism. It's actually worked very well. There have been over 15 cases so far that have been brought up by the United States. Most of them to date have been resolved, but this is not the same thing as labor reform in Mexico. And so we shouldn't mix up USMCA and labor reform in Mexico, which is a Mexican process, which has support from the United States and support from a number of stakeholders in the United States, but is only going to happen if the Mexican government and their participants actually put this in place. Digital trade is a major area of potential growth, but the United States is currently rethinking its approach to digital trade. And some of you may have read some of the articles about that, which are circulating now every day, with a number of people very upset with the Biden administration for calling for a pause on what you do with digital trade and rethinking that. Small and medium enterprises, it's really important, one, because they're the biggest employers in countries. 2, if you get them involved, you can both expand the prosperity effect of trade across North America, but it's really hard to get them involved. So you have to be creative. So far, there's a start, but there's no real clear mechanism to bring them in a large number way. Other big important area is something called regulatory cooperation. Regulatory cooperation is really technical, but it is very important for the amount of trade that goes on. Regulations can block trade. It's really hard to negotiate, and so far under USMCA it's not evident to me that we've done very much at all. Workforce development, Andrew's going to talk about this a little bit more. Emergency planning at the border. We've seen how the border has gotten stopped up. There's now an agreement to set up rules for handling emergencies, but we haven't actually used those yet. Transparency is really important if you're going to get public support for this. And what I said earlier, public diplomacy, reaching out to the public and explaining what's going on, and we aren't very good at that. And then there's another discussion going on about broadening USMCA. Should we bring more people into this? So there are a number of recommendations at the end of the chapter that discuss this, that suggest a push before the review to try to make progress on all of these, to demonstrate you can resolve disputes, to show to the stakeholders and others that there are good results in a lot of these different areas. The biggest push will probably come after the elections in each country, just because I think people are going to be distracted between now and then. But there's a lot to be done before 2026 starts, and there's a great deal of potential for good that can keep this growth in trade, the spreading the prosperity going across North America. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Wayne. And I think 2026 is not just going to be a critical year in terms of USMCA, but if I may say so myself, I'm pretty excited about the World Cup in North America. And I think that that's a great opportunity as well to attract investment, to strengthen supply chains, and to really kind of show that the USMCA and North America are working as a regional bloc.
And to have advertisements for USMCA in the breaks.
There you go. You're going to be in charge of that campaign, Ambassador Wayne. But we're moving on to nearshoring, and Andrew, we previously mentioned how ongoing tensions between the U.S. and China have prompted many U.S. companies even to undertake a massive relocation of their factories to Mexico, a phenomenon which is called, along other terms, nearshoring, friendshoring, ally-shoring. But this means that companies are progressively transferring part of their production to countries close to their markets and with similar time zones to minimize the effects of disruptions in supply chains. And Mexico has inherent advantages to attract nearshoring, including a large internal market, an extensive network of free trade agreements, and comparatively low labor costs, and all contributing to an influx of nearshoring investment. You, Andrew, in your chapter, you address four main pillars that are needed to really create an environment for more conducive to economic growth and development. And those are workforce development, which Ambassador Wayne alluded to, energy, which we got a really good introduction to from Duncan, security, which I will talk a little bit more in depth after you are done, Andrew, and infrastructure. So could you please discuss these four areas in further detail and how they are going to have an impact in nearshoring?
Sure, be happy to. Though, as you point out, I really could just sit back because you've already talked about a lot of it. But seriously, I think that again reinforces the fact that all of this is interconnected. Duncan mentioned, I think I'm probably misquoting you a little bit, Duncan, but how you needed nearshoring to drive energy, and I think it works the other way as well. That if we don't get what we need, what Duncan described on energy, it's going to be hard to maintain the pace of nearshoring. But let me take one step back. I mean, Leela pointed out that nearshoring largely was driven by not only the Trump administration tariffs on China and companies' decisions to try to pull back from China, but of course also the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think the combination of those really has driven companies to look at supply chain resilience so that we're not dependent on one source, no matter who that is or where they are. And also the idea of shortening supply chains. And Mexico has absolutely benefited from this trend. As Ambassador Wayne noted, trade is up substantially. Mexico is also attracting a lot of foreign direct investment, $35 billion last year and another $29 billion in the first half of this year. So the focus of this section really is about what can Mexico do to make sure that this is not just a blip in time, that the pace continues. And as you said, Leela, I think there really were four areas that jump out. It's also important, and Duncan covered this as well, is that when you think about nearshoring, I think people generally think about northern Mexico. But the truth is nearshoring can and should go other places and can go other places. We all think about north of Mexico because that's where most of the investment has gone to date. More than half of it to 5 states and over 80% to 15 states, which means the other 17 states aren't really part of this yet. And I think that will be a challenge for the next president of trying to figure out how to bring the rest of the country along. So there have been a lot of conversations about nearshoring, as you mentioned, Leila, nearshoring, friendshoring, ally shoring. They are slightly different, but I think conceptually all the same kind of idea. Widespread agreement on what needs to happen, and also I think widespread agreement that what has happened, the investment that I mentioned so far, has largely occurred in spite of this administration, the AMLO administration's actions, not due to it. Though it was only last month that they introduced some tax incentives to encourage investment or relocation of production in 10 key sectors, and that's an important step forward. So of the four main areas, since some have already been covered, I'll try to focus a little bit more on a couple of them. Ambassador Wayne mentioned workforce development, and what we really mean there, what we find when you talk to the private sector is that industries need skilled workers. As I think the audience well knows, we're beyond the sort of simple assembly now. And what the private sector finds is that even people who have graduated from high school or college don't actually have the marketable skills, and they invest a lot of time in having to train the workers that they think they've hired to fill jobs. So to address that, you really need targeted training programs that incorporate academia, government, and the private sector to make sure that people are learning the skills they actually need to learn. Guanajuato has a state training institute, which is a good example. They work very closely with the private sector to make sure that they are teaching the skills that this private sector would then hire or be looking for. And this comes up a lot in the high-level economic dialogue as well. And this is something that's important, of course, to remember. Workforce development doesn't happen overnight. It takes years to train somebody, for example, to be an engineer. And so a couple of the recommendations in this rubric or this sector of workforce development are to revise public school curricula so that they emphasize new and emerging technology. In other words, start earlier and make sure students are prepared for the new technologies rather than having the private sector have to employ them later. And another piece that I think that's really important is to support for the new president, to support state-level efforts to identify their comparative advantages and their opportunities to advance along the value chain, to improve the value of what they're producing. One example I'd share is that former Governor Murat in Oaxaca worked with the IDB to do an analysis of Oaxaca's comparative advantages. And that, too, helps you figure out what it is you need to train people to do. Infrastructure is another big part. It's the one that we haven't really talked about quite as much. And I think there's really two parts. There's the U.S.-Mexico border part, which is largely focused on doing things to reduce the bottlenecks, to introduce technology that allows goods, legitimate goods, to flow more quickly across the border and allows law enforcement to stop the bad stuff in both directions. That means you need to right-size and right-tech POEs, including the possibility of building, like, for example, cold storage facilities at ports that are heavily used by the produce industry to facilitate the movement of those products. Secretary Barcina recently requested or suggested they need U.S. support to modernize the border when she spoke at a recent conference here in Washington and made a lot of the same points that came up in our Building a Competitive U.S. Border Conference this summer. So that's encouraging. The South, the focus in the South is different, and Duncan again mentioned some of this, the idea that in order to capitalize on the Transisthmus, which really is an incredible opportunity for Mexico, not only to be a transshipment point of moving goods from the Pacific to the Atlantic and vice versa, but actually a place where development can occur, where production can occur. It's also worth noting that even though I sort of dismissed the transit, developing the Transisthmus also is going to create a new access route to the east coast of the U.S., so that can be really helpful as well. But getting back to sort of the development part, with investment in road, rail, and ports, you really can create a new development pole, a pole that Eric will talk about this in a little bit, where if you address the water infrastructure issues, which will be an issue even though they have plenty of water, they're not in drought, but if you can get the infrastructure right, you can really create a new development pool. And the other point, as I said earlier, everything is all connected. Creating more development in the south of Mexico may also have a positive impact on flows of migration from Central America and southern Mexico. How am I doing on time?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. Well, Duncan talked a lot about energy as well, and as I said, there's an overlap. I think the key point for attracting nearshoring is the need to provide access to reliable, affordable, clean energy, and that, the clean energy is critically important. Mexico is going to have to reduce its reliance on fossil fuel generated electricity so that investors can meet their global emissions targets. And Mexico has the potential to do that, as he mentioned, with solar in the north, wind and hydro in the south. And those are critically important. The other piece that's mentioned in this sector is the importance of Mexico working collaboratively with the US and Canada to develop some regional emission reduction targets, again, to promote that idea of North America as a appropriate destination for investment. And then just quickly on security, which Leela's going to cover in detail. I think when it comes to nearshoring, there are some pretty specific and important issues related to security. It's really about the security of workers and products, of goods being moved to a factory or from a factory to the border, and that happening safely. Because otherwise there are increased costs of movement. There are also challenges. Companies sometimes have challenges getting senior management or filling senior management positions because of the danger of some of their locations. So I think it's going to be really important for the incoming government to make a concerted effort to demonstrate a commitment to addressing those issues and really sort of pushing back on organized crime, which is encroaching in areas and businesses where it had not been in the past. So folks who sort of thought they were isolated or insulated from it are finding they're not. And I guess the last point I'd make there is that I think Mexico has, when you're trying to attract foreign investment, there's a real perception challenge or risk that if you're a general manager from Mexico talking to your board in New York or Copenhagen or wherever you are, you spend a lot of time convincing the board, oh, no, it's not as dangerous as you think because we're not located there or whatever. And I think and there is still investment. So I guess where I would end is if you look at the numbers of what's happening and then you think about what could be happening, that's really what the next president has in front of them, is the opportunity to continue this wave of nearshoring and not have it just be a one-off moment in time.
Thank you, Andrew. Are you going to keep track of time for me?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, I had the monumental task of trying to condense Mexican security in 6 pages. Anybody that tries to do that, it's extremely difficult. I think we all had some kind of, a difficulty in trying to reduce the amount of topics that we wanted to really address in such, in a short amount of pages. But I think that was part of the challenge. So I do want to address kind of the methodology that my co-author and myself kind of took. Security is not only a multi-layered, complex, and cross-cutting issues, but we try to focus on issues that are not generally or as frequently discussed. And we drew from a lot of the conversations, as Andrew pointed out in his introductory remarks, from private conversations that we had with some of our advisory board members and experts and academics and public officials. And so I tried to take a little bit of all that and include it into the chapter. I want to thank Ambassador Feely, who's here with us today, for all of his support and insight into security. Ambassador Wayne, who, for better or worse, I had the opportunity to work when I was working at the Mexican federal government, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, and he was extremely helpful in putting all the information that we have in the security chapter. But like I said, we didn't include all the traditional security issues, but we did do some, right? So illicit drugs and arms trafficking, as well as how to really strengthen bilateral cooperation in terms of security between the United States and Mexico. But we also provided at least hopefully we did, a more nuanced analysis on security issues that, like I said, are not as frequently discussed or perhaps are not the top priority in terms of U.S.-Mexico cooperation, but even further in terms of security issues that are occurring at an alarming rate in Mexico and that are not as famous or as talked about on the news and in the media. So we delve into issues such as gender-based violence and femicides, attacks into journalists and activists, and how high levels of insecurity and violence pose a serious threat to Mexico's democracy. We also delve into issues of border infrastructure and cybersecurity, and like I said, rebuilding trust between security agencies on both sides of the border to enhance bilateral security cooperation. That said, we did not include pressing issues in Mexico, such as the militarization of civilian forces, combating transnational criminal organizations, money laundering, among others. Yet we do plan to release longer policy papers on all of these issues in the coming months. Part of the way that we approached this, Cecilia Farfan Mendez and myself, who I want to give a shout out yet again to Cecilia for all of her help in putting this chapter together, was that we're going to enter an electoral period where there's going to be really heated rhetoric, right, on both sides of the border, and usually security is at the forefront of that agenda. And what we're trying to do is really bring the conversation back to issues that are really important to the U.S., but more so to Mexico and to Mexico's future president. And so one of the areas that we have found and in talks with experts is there's been a real deterioration in terms of trust, of really focusing on having mutual trust between the U.S. and Mexico, and really strengthening bilateral security cooperation on issues such as improving rule of law and enhancing border and cybersecurity and bringing criminals to justice. But Mexico, and this is something that we've been focusing on, right? What is Mexico's next president going to be doing about all of these issues? And while we are focused on Mexico, security is one of those issues that's you really can't talk about it without really addressing the bilateral relationship. And so we've heard in terms of, the big topics. Illicit arms trafficking is one of the priorities. It always has been for the Mexican government. Fentanyl and the fentanyl crisis here in the United States is the priority, I would say, or one of the top priorities for the U.S. government. But Mexico needs to demonstrate that it's serious about collaborating to reduce illicitly manufactured fentanyl production and trafficking, and dedicate meaningful resources in D.C. and subnational levels to change the perilous perception of Mexico's lack of commitment to improve cross-border security. And so while there might still be some intelligence sharing, and there are specific actions that the Mexican military in particular are doing to dismantle, clandestine laboratories in Mexico that are producing fentanyl, the reality is that the rhetoric at the highest level in Mexico is affecting the way that security cooperation is perceived in the United States. And while we do have the bicentennial framework that replaced the Merida Initiative, and we have the high-level security dialogue, both are very important institutional mechanisms. Tangible results will only occur when measurable outcomes for success are established. And so one of the recommendations, or a few of the recommendations that we have put forward in terms of rebuilding trust between security agencies operating on both sides of the border, are reactivating technical trainings and capacity building, as well as strengthening transparency policies and public information, which is something that is more directed toward the next leader of Mexico, right? The INAI has been very underfunded and is being attacked by the elites in Mexico, and really having transparency in terms of information sharing, intelligence sharing is key in rebuilding this trust. And like I said, we discussed illicitly manufacturing fentanyl, and these are recommendations, again, more focused towards the next Mexican president. While it is true that we have to focus on the supply side intervention of fentanyl, we can't just focus on the supply side. So we have to also address demand in the United States, but there has to be a destigmatizing as well of users, right? And really focus on those who are profiting from drug trafficking instead of the users who are better served by public health approaches. There's another angle that we discuss in this chapter, which I think is extremely interesting and extremely important, and that's that effective drug policies also need to consider the environmental impacts of illicit drug production, right? So meth and synthetic opiate production in Mexico are damaging the environment, impacting the health of local populations as well as ecosystems. And the fentanyl crisis, interestingly enough, has offered sort of an important window of opportunity for the Mexican government to provide illicit economic alternatives in areas previously sustained through opium gum income. I think all of you here have heard, for example, about Hurricane Otis that hit in Guerrero. Guerrero is one of those states that is the highest produces high levels of opium gum, and because people are now finding themselves in dire situations where there might be unemployment, high levels of unemployment, organized crime can capture a lot of these unemployed citizens of Guerrero and put them into illicit activities. So that's one of the consequences that can derive from natural impacts such as a hurricane. But also the fentanyl crisis offers the Mexican government the ability to bring these people back to, more of licit activities. That said, not all licit activities are free of violence, right? We have seen that producing avocados or limes are still very much highly involved with criminal actors in different regions of Mexico. Illicit firearms trafficking, that's something that we discuss as to what Mexico can do. A lot of you already know that 70% of firearms recovered in Mexico between 2014 and 2018 were submitted for tracing and were linked to the United States, though the Mexican government seems to make it out that more than 90% of firearms recovered in Mexico can be traced back to the United States. One of our major recommendations in this aspect is for Mexico to pay close attention to the implementation of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which, among other provisions, established a federal criminal offense for straw purchasing, which is any purchase in which a second person agrees to acquire a firearm or for someone else. So I'm going to skip a little bit because if not, I'm going to go way over. Oh, I already have 1 minute. Okay. Gender journalism and democracy and activism is another aspect that we really focus on. We launched our femicide initiative last year, and we've done a lot of work on that. We have a report available on the Mexico Institute website on it. But the fact that journalists, activists, environmental activists, political candidates, women especially, are being targeted by criminal groups is something that risks the future of Mexico's democracy. We also talk about border infrastructure and cybersecurity, which I will not be able to necessarily talk about in great depth, but I do believe that part of what Andrew and also Ambassador Wayne discussed briefly is that if we do want to strengthen commercial ties with the North American region, Mexico has to prevent from being the weakest link in terms of cybersecurity threats and really be able to allow the United States to work with Mexico in terms of deploying emerging and innovative technologies to the border to be able to trace illicit goods. But for that, Mexico needs to reassure its partners, which is also on the digital trade, Chapter 19 of the USMCA, that it has the ability to respond and to recuperate from cyber threats and cyber attacks. We saw that there's been incidents in the Mexican government that has really debilitated Mexico's cybersecurity capabilities, and that's something that we recommend that the next president addresses. But with that, I will end, and we can talk. We'll hopefully have some time to take questions, so we are getting close on time. I'm going to shift to migration, which is also very closely related to security, but for different reasons. And when we think of migration and Mexico, Ariel, one of the first things that comes to mind, right, are the amount of the number of immigrants trying to cross illegally between the U.S. and Mexico border. And while it is true that the number of individuals and families that are trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border in the last year has increased with a record 2.5 million encounters of migration occurring in fiscal year 2023, Mexico has now become a transit and a recipient country of migrants from the Western Hemisphere and beyond. In your migration chapter, Ariel, you offer a comprehensive analysis of Mexico's migration policy framework, and you discuss how 3 previously separate migration pillars, immigration, transit migration, and immigration in Mexico, now intersect and interact with each other, requiring simultaneous policy consideration. Could you discuss this phenomena in further detail and what Mexico's future leaders should do to address current institutional immigration policy challenges?
Sure, and thank you so much for the invitation to work with all of you in the book. I think it's important to try to see how decisions intersect and in fact, how they can actually be complementary to each other in terms of the causes and the effects. So one of the key things that the chapter that I wrote for this booklet really sets to do is to try to, as you suggested, link how these are not issues that tend to be that are either going to be solved overnight or that have one unique solution, but rather that have to come together in a mix of factors that we've seen in Mexico now for years. As you suggested, Mexico has actually been a country of emigration for decades, and more recently we've seen it become also a country of transit. But what's happened in the last few years that has really made this a very timely moment for Mexico to change and to adapt in some of its reforms is that it's becoming significantly every year more and more a destination for migration from the Western Hemisphere to Mexico, potentially. I think one of the issues that we've seen oftentimes that maybe has pushed back the potential in how Mexico engages in migration issues is the fact that Mexico and the U.S. and others see it as migration that tends to happen to Mexico because of the United States. But because of the moment that Mexico finds itself in, it is really coming to be a point of, it's going to define what Mexico goes to do in the future. It's no longer about what's Mexico doing to help the U.S., though it is important to consider how collaboration effects are included in here, but also what immigration and return migration and transit can do for Mexico. In a decade or so, Mexico is going to continue to become an aging population in which many of the effects that we see in the United States are going to be replicated and reflected in the Mexican population, but also in the economy. And this is a really important point in time for Mexico to take advantage of some of the migration that's happening through its territory. The intersection that I mentioned that I address in the chapter is really about connecting immigration, transit, destination with the different aspects of implementation, implications and consequences that have to do with return migration, enforcement capacity, and refugee protection. That's how I think a lot of these intersections can come to be and actually provide a bigger outlook for the next president in Mexico. Most of the time when we think of migration, the first thing that comes to mind in the US but also in Mexico is enforcement and containment. And certainly that has been part of the biggest evolution that Mexico has seen in its last several years. But the difference now, that is the difference that I think a future government can engage in, is to understand how to make migration work for Mexico too. We've seen, for example, and I divide this into three big areas. First, in terms of migration to Mexico, that in fact Mexican migration to the United States, its biggest receiving country, even though it's reduced in some events, it actually has increased among some particular segments of its population. We've seen a dramatic increase of Mexican families come to the U.S. and what those Mexican families do in the United States, how they're accessing services, but how they're also being helped is significantly important. The numbers that we saw for this fiscal year, for example, was that 717,000 Mexicans reached the United States-Mexico border, and many of them entered the United States. But what is not usually talked about in this aspect of containment and controls is that Mexican migration has become also more regular and more legal in ways that we hadn't expected before. There were 300,000 H-2A workers from Mexico this last fiscal year. There were 100,000 additional H-2B workers that were from Mexico this time around. And so when you think about the segment of population that legal migration not only brings to the U.S., but the benefits that it also can make to its communities in Mexico, it's important to think of those different nuances. Mexico receives also a number of returnees from the United States significantly. It's about 200,000 Mexicans are returned to Mexico from the U.S. every year. And there are others that can return from other countries, but that's also not as well tracked in the data. The second pillar that I've looked at in this book chapter is trying to understand how transit has affected and reshaped some of the initial, even if involuntary, institutions in Mexico. Mexico's National Institute of Migration is not only significantly under scrutiny in the last several months because of what happened in the fire that happened in Juarez, where many migrants died, and the conditions there were not up to standard, but also because of the way that the capacity that Mexican migration has to actually enforce its own migration operations. And so one of the key things that it's important to note is that even though there was, for example, 500,000 apprehensions of migrants in Mexico this year, which is actually a record for Mexico, its capacity to actually detain migrants in centers is only about 5,000 per day. So the record level that we're seeing in terms of its capacity for INAMI to do what it intended to do is actually only a fraction of what we can see, and in fact being increasingly asked to do more in terms of control, similar to what we see in the U.S. but also in other parts of Latin America. The other underlying point in this is that there has been an increasing opportunity in changing policies of how migration control can be implemented. I think there are some good reforms. There was one, at least, on reducing and prohibiting the detention of children and their families. The issue with what happened with this reform is that it hasn't been funded significantly, and that institutions that are meant to provide and to address and implement these policies, especially for children, are significantly underfunded and oftentimes vary by state into how they're implemented. I'm talking specifically here of the DIF, which is essentially the health sector that would help in this case with children. In terms of protection, the last pillar that I wanted to mention, COMAR, which is the Refugee Asylum Agency of Mexico, has been significantly for years now underfunded. And it is not simply that the underfunding is affecting how migration happens in Mexico and the consequences of it too, but that it's continuing to create strains and allowing for smuggling to happen and to take place in Mexico in ways that are uncontrolled in many situations. Comar, for example, in 2021 received 130,000 asylum applications. It actually was the top three, the third country in the world with the most applications in 2021 for asylum. In 2023, 150,000 are estimated to be 150,000 applications are estimated to be received in Comar, which will place it around 3 or 4 in the world, but it's still a significant number. Even despite this number of increases in asylum requests and protection assistance, Mexico has a budget of 166 million pesos for the year, which is about $10 million US, which is a significant fraction of what agencies like in this capacity could get. Not only that, but about 30%, only 30% of that funding comes from the federal government, because IOM and UNHCR, in fact, are the ones providing the main income for for that to happen. So to finish up here in the conclusions, and there are many well outlined in the book, one of the key things to consider is not just how Mexico is engaging in control and enforcement, but how it can use this moment to think of creative ways to attract workers for those that are willing to stay or may consider staying even for brief periods of time to be able to contribute to the Mexican economy, perhaps in some of the ways that others here have outlined. The second piece is to think about how not just migration happens inside or transit to Mexico, but also what in the next president's agenda could actually be an opportunity to grow for issues along the consular service they provide. Mexico does provide a lot of consular service in the United States, but how it reshapes them to protect and provide assistance, for example, to migrant workers in the United States would be important. And then finally, the issue of Comar and capacity, just generally institutions, we often think of it as funding, and that is significantly one of the key opportunities. But there's also a lot of things that Mexico can take in its processing of how migrants are received, but also adjudicated the different statuses they can provide that actually could go longer in the ways that they can actually help people. So yes, certainly funding and increasing budgets for these institutions is important, but there's also smaller on the margins actions in the short term that the next president of Mexico can take to make not just processing easier, but also more helpful and beneficial for Mexico going forward. So I'll leave it for that.
Thank you, Ariel. And when we discuss the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship and even just Mexico internally, one of the most contentious points is actually water and water management, right? We usually talk about security and migration and nearshoring and commercial ties, which are extremely important. But I think water is one of those issues that is going to pose an extreme threat, which it already is, but also in the near future. And so, Eric, you and Andrew wrote the water chapter, but you will be presenting on it today. Could you please discuss water insecurity and water management challenges that Mexico faces internally, but also in the border region with the United States, and if possible, because I know we're all restrained on time, talk briefly about the 1944 water treatment and its relevance going forward?
Yes, definitely. First off, thank you, Leela. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to be part of this booklet launch. It's an incredible honor. What began as a chapter intending to highlight the water insecurity, specifically at the border, transformed into a large-scale analysis of the whole water insecurity issue in Mexico as a whole. The fact of the matter is that Mexico has a huge imbalance between regions in terms of availability of and demand for water. Populations and industries in central, north, and northeast Mexico have access to only 33% of the nation's renewable water, while the southeast has access to the remaining 67%. Now, exactly where does Mexico obtain its water from? Well, Mexico has access to 653 groundwater aquifers, which account for about 20% of its renewable water, and the remaining 80% comes from 757 surface-level basins. And with such a vast array of water sources, one would expect civilian populations, to have ready access to water. Unfortunately, according to data from CONAGUA, the average person in Mexico receives only 240 liters of water per day. To put it into context, the average American utilizes over 310 liters per day. In fact, only 58% of Mexico's population of 120 million people have daily access to water. The majority of water consumption within Mexico comes from the incredibly vital agricultural sector upon which Mexico relies on for not only feeding its domestic population, but massive amounts of total exports across the world per year. According to Conagua, roughly 3/4, actually more than 3/4, about 77% of water is used in food production. And that being said, inefficiencies in the hydrological infrastructure lead to massive losses across the country, such that roughly 50% of the water carried through pipes and other infrastructure does not reach its intended recipient. To make matters worse, food production will need to grow by at least 70% to keep up with Mexico's growing population, which will basically lead to a 55% increase in water usage across the country. This is an incredibly scary projection because when you consider the fact that out of the 653 groundwater aquifers I mentioned earlier, at present at least 157 of them are already overexploited, all of those being in central, north, and northeast Mexico. Likewise, the 757 surface level basins that I mentioned, around 60% of those have already been contaminated by agricultural, industrial, urban, and residential pollution. As it stands, even disregarding pollution, an increase in water extraction of the magnitude needed to keep up with Mexico's growing population is completely unsustainable and will move towards further depletion of Mexico's water sources. One of the most important things that we wanted to highlight in this chapter for the next administration is the importance of preserving renewable water. What I mean by that is that continuous unchecked over-extraction of our aquifers and surface level basins doesn't allow these sources of water to naturally replenish themselves through the water cycle. We identified 3 main stressors that are making the hydrological scarcity issue even worse. And those 3 main stressors are amplified even further through the growing threat of climate change. As I mentioned before, Mexico's population has skyrocketed in the past 5 decades and will keep moving forward. Projections show that by 2030, 62.7% of Mexico will be living in large metropolitan zones. Simply put, more people equals more demand. The next stressor is the fact that Mexico's hydrological infrastructure is simply outdated and inefficient. Leaks and other breaks generate significant water losses nationwide. Additionally, only 50% of water collected through sewage receives any sort of treatment, meaning that Mexico is actively missing out on a large portion of water that could have been used for agricultural, urban, or drinking use, if only the infrastructure was a little bit more efficient. There's also an incredible environmental injustice aspect to Mexico's inadequate infrastructure because the most vulnerable and impoverished communities in Mexico are often located in areas where the infrastructure and water systems are more likely to be neglected, inefficient, frequently out of service. These communities face water shutdowns, massive losses, wastewater discharges, which carry pathogens and viruses. And so this not only highlights the inadequate water systems across the country, but also a little bit of Mexico's social disparity issues. And the final stressor is a little bit more specific. It's relating to Mexico's inefficiency in its city planning and its unnatural gray infrastructure. Over in the north of Mexico, urban zones across Mexico, especially in the north, are sprawling concrete masses with very little green zones. According to a report from Conagua, 50% of the nation's vegetational coverage has been lost, and as a result, natural systems are suffering. Impervious surfaces like highways and parking lots and roofs, they don't capture rainwater. Instead, the runoff just slides off, and they create these crazy high-velocity stream flows, which lead to property damage, long-term erosion. The infrastructure can't handle the rapid stream flows and even loss of life sometimes. So skyrocketing population, inadequate infrastructure, and these gray urban zones, you add that together, and then you mix in climate phenomena like hurricanes, floods, and droughts that are getting worse by the year. In this global temperature crisis, you end up with a country that has a reduced water supply and poor water quality. There are 4.5 million Mexican citizens in the border region who currently live under drought conditions. These droughts make it even harder for the water sources to replenish themselves through the water cycle, like I said. And so the drought conditions are starting to become the new normal, which is quite scary. And so we have 3 categories of recommendations. First, the category of water insecurity is the most straightforward group of recommendations. The main point is the need to implement a hydrological cycle approach where water reclamation, recycling, groundwater recharge, and better treatment is used to ensure stable sources of water so we can make sure that the bodies of water keep having a certain level for access for Mexican citizens. Additionally, top-to-bottom renovation at weak points in the infrastructure should be one of Conagua's main priorities. We recommend that Conagua locate the areas where repairs can be most impactful and focus limited resources on the construction of higher efficiency technologies. They should also be constructed when considered when constructing the newer infrastructure in these new urban zones. Second category is something that, although grossly important to the relationship between the United States and Mexico, I've yet to speak about the treaty between, it's a mouthful, so I'm not going to say the whole thing. The 1944 Water Treaty was an agreement between the two countries, which created the IBWC and SILA, which is a single international authority, but with two respective sections for each of the countries. And they come together to manage, conserve, protect the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. We recommend giving continued attention to this water treaty, especially the more recent minutes, which are sort of addendums, specifically minute 323, which conserves existing water sources, highlights guidelines for times of scarcity, and furthers bilateral investment in water efficiency projects. On top of that, it's paramount that the IBWC continue to incorporate climate experts and local actors with specialized knowledge like farmers and industry officials, people that interact with the water on a daily basis. Lastly, the third category relates to the fight against the effects of climate change. We strongly recommend that the next administration allocate additional resources to CONAGUA and the Secretariat of Infrastructure, Communications, and Transportation to fund necessary upgrades to enhance resilience against climate change, incorporating nature-based green infrastructure like green roofs, rain gardens, rainwater harvesting, bioswales, and urban tree canopies. Just a couple of examples. They act as buffer zones, temperature regulators, they even improve air quality, and they've shown to improve mental, physical, and community health. Now, this chapter could not have been completed with reports from CONAGUA and UNAM. I don't consider myself an expert on water, but this is an incredibly complex and vital issue that, with huge help from Andrew and Leila, we managed to complete. And so, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you,
That was for
Eric.
the sake of time.
Thank you. Well, let me tell you, if he's not an expert on water, you do a really good job
Thank you.
at talking about water. I think you know way more than most of us do, and it's a great chapter, so I encourage everybody to read it. We do have about 10 minutes, which I'm very surprised about. We have 10 minutes for questions. If any of our in-audience attendees want to pose a question to, I'm happy to, I have questions. But if you would like to pose a question to any or all of our panelists up here, be happy to take your questions. And if not, we have some questions from our virtual audience as well.
Jordi Amaral, founder and author of the America's Migration Brief newsletter, amongst other roles. I guess my question is for Ariel, but also for you, Leila, and I think it's also relevant for Eric as well. Mm-hmm. And it's about internal displacement in Mexico. I think last year or the year before, a bill to address internal displacement was introduced, but then it stagnated in the Senate. So I was curious to, just hear, your guys' thoughts about that, but also, where it's progressing and its relevance, considering violence and insecurity in the country, but also considering climate change, water, those issues which I think across the region are not getting enough thought when it comes to migration. The vast majority of migration related to climate change is internal, so that's definitely a component in such a bill that should be considered, but I believe in the Mexican case is not in the bill. So any comments about the potential of paying attention to that in consideration of the bill? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one more and then we can answer in bulk.
Yes, Ray Michael Bridgewater. Our area of concentration is around health and technology. So the health challenges in Mexico, what's happening, how do you fare the pandemic? What's the future of the pandemic? I mean, food security, there was already a question around the climate change, but food security, health challenges now and into the future.
And I'm going to finish with one question that we got from our virtual audience, and that is, to what extent is that trade increase just Chinese companies rebasing in Mexico? How do you keep it from just another round of imperialism, but by China? So that could be for you, Ambassador Wayne. Ariel, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for your question. One of the key things that certainly, or why it's really important to think about internal displacement because it tends to be the first stage of international migration. And certainly the numbers that we've seen from UNHCR and others show that there has been an increase in internal displacement in Mexico in particular states. They tend to be the same states where violence has been seen increasing, but there's also near states that tend to face more issues on climate change and climate events that are now added to the picture. States usually in the south parts of Mexico. What we've seen, or what I know about that proposal in the Senate, was that one of the key challenges of that is trying to understand. I think there's goodwill to try to do it, but I think that there's capacity constraints on how to fund additional work without additional institutional leverage. In particular, one of the things that we had seen reports about for this internal displacement law is who would then take to account what those actions and the authorities would be. Comar had been the agency thought to be the one that could take this work, but just as I mentioned earlier, Comar already significantly underfunded, having additional responsibilities to understand and to work on displacement issues would make it even more difficult for them to create. So I think it's not a matter of, I think people, especially when people that are thinking about migration in the Mexican government and in Mexico City, understand that that's a big part of what we're seeing, but they haven't yet been able to formulate or understand yet within Congress in Mexico what it would look like to actually provide the responsibility. And just finally on that, because internal displacement has been increasing too in this year for 2023, we have seen an increase in number of Mexican families coming to the United States as well. So where before internal displacement was maybe less visible and most motivated in the southern central states of Mexico, now you're beginning to see how internal displacement is in some cases resulting in arrivals at the U.S.-Mexico border and primarily of families in sectors.
And if I can just add sort of a security angle to your question, and it's indirectly related, I think the amount of disappearances in Mexico, more than 110,000, with their whereabouts unknown, is something to not worry. Not only, the next Mexican president needs to worry about, but it also has to deal with what sort of the risks, right, and consequences that migrants can face when traveling through Mexico, in addition to human smuggling and human trafficking and being pulled into organized crime, but as well into the informal sector. And so these are all challenges that I think the next Mexican president is going to inherit. And I think because of climate change and internal displacement trends, I think we are going to see more activity in Mexico, not only as Mexican families try to flee, but also how the Mexican migration system is really going to be able to capture all these new migrants in Mexican territory, and the amount of services that the Mexican government is going to have to provide for all of these new migrants that are staying in Mexican territory. So I just wanted to add that aspect to it. But Andrew, do you want to address the health question?
Sure. Great question, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice in the time that Leela's going to give me. But health is definitely one of those issues we didn't include, but we certainly could have, and hopefully will address in subsequent programming. I mean, the short answer to your question about the pandemic is Mexico did not manage the pandemic well at all. It had one of the highest excess death rates in the world. Mexico now is suffering drug shortages, particularly for things like pediatric oncology drugs, due to some unsuccessful efforts to reform the system undertaken by this administration. I think, again, without going into taking up a lot of time, I think there are, in fact, some real challenges in terms of how Mexico procures medication and distributes it. It's a very bifurcated or multifurcated, if that's a word, health system, and looking forward to reform, which the current administration indicated when it came in it was going to start exploring, kind of move to a single payer sort of system. I think it was Denmark quality healthcare, which hasn't taken place. So I think the next president will have some real challenges in some cases, repairing the damage that was done in this administration. But it is important to point out that the health system was in trouble before the pandemic. So this is not something that this government caused, but I think it's definitely something that the next government is going to have to address.
Pastor Wayne, you want to discuss China's imperialism in Mexico?
I'd love to discuss
Okay.
China's imperialism.
you.
It's always a good
Thank
topic.
you.
There are many, many centuries that we can look back to. on that.
If we can keep it to this one, because
Oh,
we have 2
okay.
minutes. Thank you.
let me just add on the health system. Mexico's statistical agency recently came out with a report on poverty in Mexico, and they said poverty in Mexico had declined, but access to medicines had actually declined significantly especially among the poorer people during this administration. So there was already a problem. There's still a problem, and it needs reform. That's clearly right. On investment, most of the investment coming into Mexico is from the United States. The next ranked investors are from Europe. There is Chinese investment. It has not shown up in statistically important amounts yet. It may well grow going forward, but we're not seeing that yet. So I think, but very interestingly, Mexico has been attracting new investment, significant new investment, as I mentioned earlier, has all of North America. So I think a lot of people are just seeing North America as a promising place to invest. And that probably includes smart Chinese entrepreneurs who are looking to invest in Mexico.
And I think
Just one very quick thing. If I'm not wrong, there's a strong correlation between Mexico's trade deficit with the United States and Mexico's trade deficit with China.
Yeah,
And so rather than the investment side of things, it's more about the trade equation.
right. A lot of the inputs for what gets built in Mexico come from China. And that's true of autos, it's true of flat screen TVs, it's true of a number of other goods that we in the United States buy from Mexico.
Fentanyl.
That's true there too.
that is very
But
true.
President Xi reportedly is going
Yep.
to
Yep.
work it out with President Biden this week. We'll see.
And interestingly enough, I think the other side to that coin, Ambassador Wayne, is also there's a lot of, not significant, but it's interesting to mention some of the investment that's coming in from Taiwan, and especially in the border region with Mexico and the
Yeah.
United States.
No,
Yeah.
there's a big one up on the New Mexico border with Mexico.
That's right.
Very large investment, right.
Well, we are 2 minutes or a minute before concluding today's panel. I just want to thank all of our authors. It's been really an honor and just a delight to work with each and every one of you. And I do want to mention one other kind of project that we have included into our electoral cycle programming, and that's our elections blog. It is now live on the microsite. It is now live in the Mexico Institute's website. It is a microsite. And it is all the information, basic information regarding Mexico's electoral process, its candidates, the history of elections, the role of the INE. We have expert analysis as well as updated polling data on there. So we encourage everyone to go and visit if it's of interest to get more information about the electoral cycle in Mexico. And I want to thank everybody that came here in person with us today and everybody that's joining virtually. We hope to see you in the very near future. And please take a book for all of you that are here, and hopefully everybody will be able to access the text electronically as well. So thank you very much, everybody.